This is episode number 152. Today, we're featuring artist Mitch Baird.
This is the PleinAir Podcast with Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. In the PleinAir Podcast, we cover the world of outdoor painting. Called PleinAir, the French coined the term, which means open air or outdoors. The French pronounce it plein air. Others say plein air. No matter how you say it, there is a huge movement of artists around the world who are going outdoors to paint. And this show is about that movement. Now, here's your host, author, publisher, and painter, Rhoads.
Thank you, Jim Kipping, and welcome to the first PleinAir Podcast of December 2019. For those of you who are wanting to sell more artwork and have a better year, I'm going to discuss what you can be doing now to prepare for 2020. That'll be in the Marketing Minute after the interview. Well, as predicted, we sold a lot of seats for the PleinAir convention when the price deadline went up on Black Friday. There's still a couple of seats remaining, but clearly not enough to last very long. If you intend to go, I highly suggest you get it done. We've already tried to add more seats and have been told by the convention center and the fire marshal, no can do. If you're looking for a great artist gift, by the way, a must-have is the easel brush clip. Everybody's using them. You see them everywhere out there. They keep your brushes where you can see them, right where you can grab them easily. They don't fall off your trays. I've had more brushes in the mud or in the dirt. Not fun. I don't like to bend over anymore. Yep. That hurts that old back sometimes. Anyway, I have two in my studio easel, one on each of my PleinAir easels, and you can see a video at easelbrushclip.com. And they're pretty inexpensive, too. Coming up after the interview, I'll be answering art marketing questions in the Marketing Minute, including, as I said, some advice for 2020. But first, our interview with Mitch Baird. Mitch Baird, welcome to the PleinAir Podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be a part of it.
Well, man, we're honored to have you.
Well, thanks.
So for the people who are listening who might yet not be familiar with you, kind of give us a lowdown about you as a painter. What is it you do?
I guess you could say I'm mostly a landscape painter, traditional. I'm kind of a representational, but I'm kind of a naturalist. I like to try to chase the natural color out there. I studied illustration. That's what kind of got me into the field of painting. And from that point, I kind of broke off and just began painting. I like to paint everything. I studied the figure in college. That's kind of my goal to one day get back to that. But with family life and whatnot, it's kind of hard to arrange models and, set up interiors and all that stuff. So I kind of go to the landscape because it's there, it's accessible. I love the natural part of the world as much as I love the figure. So anyway, that's kind of what I've been pursuing the last decade and a half, is mostly landscape painting.
Okay. Well, I think that helps. Thank you very much. I was looking around on your website, which is mitchbaird.com. Yeah, and
needs to be updated.
Yeah, I didn't want to say anything.
It's all right. It's been a while. I know other artists are in the same boat. When you let it get away from you. But eventually, here I'm actually rebuilding it right now.
You're not in really bad shape. I talked to somebody the other day, and I went to their website, and it looked like, it went back to the old days of the original websites where, it had a button that said enter. Do you remember that?
Yeah, right. Yeah, right. I'm not that bad, but I do need an update pretty bad. So.
Well, how did this, you said you were an illustrator, but let's go back before that. This whole journey for you in art, where did you first realize that you had interest?
It's funny. Story goes, I guess it's probably the first grade. I would doodle a bunch and I would sketch. And, the teachers came to my parents and said, I think this is a kid you need to get, extracurricular activities with art because he's drawing. And I guess my parents said I was drawing perspective, roads going back and little houses. And they're like, we normally don't see this. So my parents, luckily, were a great support. I think it was I guess it was probably the second grade. They put me in painting classes. And, to me, I didn't know any better. I just remember going the first week, I was with a class of kids. And then the second week, it was on a weeknight, a different day. And I head in, I see no kids. And I'm in a room with a bunch of old white-haired ladies, which was really intimidating. I come to find out they moved me into this adult class, and it was the old Bill Alexander, which Bob Ross took over. So it was that whole, basically painting style of Bill Alexander. So as a kid, I was in these painting classes and kind of took off there, and I won a bunch of awards in elementary school. But, as I got older, I kind of not lost interest in art, but I didn't want to sit and fill a blank page. I'm a pretty active, hyperactive kid, and person now. So, I got busy skateboarding and playing soccer and ski racing, and that art was kind of my crutch to get out of math and other things. So in high school, I had private, kind of like a private study with the art teacher, which was nice. But I didn't get into the painting thing probably till I hit college. I had an amazing professor. He's my mentor still, and his name's Ralph Barksdale, and he's kind of a hermit, doesn't want to be known, but he is a master draftsman, master designer. And he's the one that really set the fire and showed me what art was. That it's not just, producing something just to produce it. There's design involved, and that's when I kind of got the fire and started to really paint seriously, and really, really kind of drop my other interests and focus on painting.
So he took you outdoors or not?
It's funny. We have arguments to this day. He's an old illustrator, and he says, the heck with outdoors. Get inside and design it. But I have arguments with him, and I say, yeah, but you can't see the color and the value out there that you can in your studio. So it's funny. We still banter about it.
Now, where was he, at BYU?
Yeah, he was at Brigham Young, correct. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I think he pretty much changed that whole why so many great painters are coming to others because of him. Now, I had another great teacher, Robert Barrett, who's another brilliant draftsman. So I had those two great teachers to kind of lead me. And at this time, you have to understand, this time it was in the 80s, illustration was going very conceptual. So I had a couple teachers that kind of battled with me about being a quote-unquote painter. And I'm looking at, Leyendecker and Rockwell and Dean Cornwell and these guys that were master painters. And that's kind of the direction I wanted to go. And they were pushing me, saying, that's not around anymore. You need to be conceptual and editorial. And so I had these fights. So when this Ralph kind of knew that and kind of took me under his wing and exposed me to these painters, turned me on to James Reynolds and Turpinning. In fact, I think I was a sophomore. Yeah, I think it was a sophomore. We knew Richard Schmid was doing this educational thing. So as a class, my teacher got me and a few other students to go, and we took a workshop from Richard. And that's what opened my eyes. When I saw him set up and paint within 15 minutes, I'm like, this is what I'm going to do, So after leaving school, I illustrated for a few years. And then once that ended, I just jumped into painting full time.
So you at the time when you started painting full time, were you married, had kids, or
just married. I worked for a couple years as an illustrator, and then my wife, she took a job. She's kind of like in the nursing field. She's not a nurse, but in the nursing field. So she took a job up in Oregon. So when we made the move up there, I just said, I'm not going back to work for anybody. I'm going to pursue painting full time. And it's ironic the way I approached it is, plein air painting to me isn't necessarily just because it's plein air. I used that 2 years when I moved up there, and I just buried myself into outdoor painting. I mean, I was out every day, and this is in Oregon where it rains, 8 months out of the year. So I was painting in my car, wherever I could be. I was trying to paint from life to get the chops to see, how nature works and find those color harmonies and understand, how light works. And so I spent, a few years really heavily trying to get my chops in painting outdoors. And I think that's probably what set me on fire. And I had huge growth spurts too. When you paint from life, that's where you get your biggest jump. So that'd be my advice to other painters that, when you go to the source, it is the truth. You're going to the source of truth and you're trying to access that information. because you just can't get it in via photo or video or any other way.
I think let me stop you there for just a second and just kind of focus on this, because I think it's a very important lesson. We have a guy that worked with us, Richard Lindenberg, and Richard had been working for a company, and then that all ended for whatever reason, and so he just decided to become a full-time painter at that point, which was a pretty gutsy move for anybody.
Yeah.
And watching his work over 2 years was really interesting, because his work went from he was already pretty good, but he went from being pretty good to being really, really good. And I think it's that idea of a concentrated effort. Those of us who kind of dabble, people like me who, I'm carrying a job and raising kids and doing a bunch of other stuff, and painting is more of a sideline or a hobby. I crave that idea of 2 continuous years of just painting every day, and what a difference it would make. Talk to us about that.
It does. You look at, I teach workshops quite a bit, and it's great to have these students who come in. I get them from all levels, and it's kind of hard because I tell them straight up. I said, look, when you come to my class, I can't teach a drawing. That's a lifetime pursuit. And it's one that needs to be, an academic 4-year school where you're literally drawing from the figure every day, like I did, and learning, understanding drawing to where it becomes intuitive and natural, and you understand how to do it. So in my classes, that's something I tell them. I say, look, I'm only here 2 weeks. All I want to do is embed in you understanding value and color temperature. Understanding those 2 things, and I really focus on that for the week I'm with them, because I've got to have them walk away with something so they don't feel let down. And I find that in any endeavor in art. So if you're a guitar player, if you're picking up a guitar, once a month, you're just not going to progress. And
that's me.
Yeah, and it's painting, and it's funny. I'm in the boat. Yeah, I guess you say you were in. I'm in the boat now where I've got a family. I got 3 little ones, and I'm not painting near as much as I should be, because I've got so many other commitments right now. I'm in that season where I'm pretty homebound and don't have a lot of time to paint. So it does, and that's my problem right now. Is I'm struggling. So I want a good 6 months to really dive into my work and explore, push my boundaries, but instead I've got deadlines and I've got shows, and so I'm kind of painting. I always feel like I'm doing the same trick pony, doing my same paintings, because I'm under deadlines. I don't have time to explore and move my, maybe how I approach painting differently. But so yeah, I understand where you're at, and everybody in this world has their time issues, and that's where you got to figure out, how can I focus and how can I get there the quickest by using whatever way possible to help you improve.
You said something about focus. I was writing a blog today for my artmarketing.com.
Yeah.
And it was a result of a friend of mine, somebody we both know, who said to me, I've noticed that I'm not selling as many paintings as I was a year and a half ago. And I said, well, what changed? And he says, well, I was making a good living. I was pretty comfortable. I started to add a bunch of stuff. So he started stacking stuff on top of it, and, things like creating an online thing, mentoring programs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he stopped, and he really reduced his amount of painting, and his paintings actually, I think, started kind of suffering, because you could tell he didn't have the rhythm. And he said, what do I do to get my sales back up? I said, stop chasing all these shiny objects and focus on painting. Yeah. And that, it's so easy to get distracted now. There are times when, like you say, we have these seasons in our lives that I certainly know about raising triplets. And there's basically from birth until college, there's, a pretty strong commitment that you have to make. So it's tough, but all the other distractions certainly can.
It's funny. I'm actually looking at probably to produce some online, kind of academy type thing as well. I also have 2 things I want to take to market, 2 products I've designed, and I'm in the research development on, and I have so many irons in the fire that, they all kind of suffer. And I'm at this point where, do I take 6 months off and I got to decide on what to work on, one or the other? And it does. It gets, my kids are 4, 8, and 12, so I'm right in the thick of it.
Yeah.
It's it is. You just kind of have to make do. And I'm kind of right now. I've got a couple shows I'm preparing for, and I'm kind of having to pick up and do odd hours. And I'm the type of painter, I like to have a good 8-hour shift. I mean, I like to be in the thick of it and in the zone for hours at a time. And lately it's been, I'll go out 2 hours here and then I got to quit, and 4 hours there and skip 2 days and then another 2 hours. And it drives me crazy because I like to be fully immersed for hours at a time. And I'm kind of having to learn to paint kind of on the fly when I can. And that affects your work as well. At least for me, it does.
Well, I get that, and in some ways it might improve you, because you probably, if you're going 8 hours straight at a time, you're probably not getting away from your paintings as much as you should.
I love you said that, because it's true. You come back and you're like, man, what was I thinking 3 days ago when I hit this, So yeah, there is and I'm finding too, I'm such an olive prima painter, wet into wet, that I'm realizing when I let it set up like that, I'm getting elements in, drag and scumble and things that I don't get, working wet into wet. So yeah, there is a growth. There's new things happening in this, in this bind that I'm in. There's still positives that are coming out of it. So
I think that's an interesting point too, because I experienced something very similar the other day. I had a painting that's been sitting on the easel and untouched for weeks. And I got back from Europe the other day, and I was thinking about it the whole trip, thinking what I was going to do with it. And I came back and I looked at it and I hated it. And so I took some paint, kind of purple paint or something, and I just coated the whole thing and then wiped it down, just because I was kind of, almost ready to kill it. And when I wiped it down, the paint hiding in the texture of the brush strokes was so appealing. Yeah. And I thought, I need to do this more. I don't do enough glazing and scumbling and things like that. So it worked out.
I don't either. Yeah, and I don't either. It's a whole nother realm I want to pursue. So, but yeah, it's interesting. It's so funny how you never know what's going to come your way. With painting, when one door closes, another opens. I think that's what keeps us coming back.
When you're teaching, what are you finding the things that you most have to address? You talked about values, and you talked about color temperature. Are those the two big things with most students?
I agree. Drawing's always an issue because we're all progressing in drawing, and so to take the pressure off the students, I literally tell them, I don't care if you're mounting sideways or your house is laying on the side. I could care less. I want to focus on something I can dive into, and I think that values is the thing that everybody misses. We're so enticed by color that we bypass the idea of value. Well, I teach that a color is only a color when its value is correct. So you have to have your value structure down for a color to read its true nature, its true color has to be the right value first. So I obviously push value very heavily because, again, you have to learn to see that. Once you see that, and we jump into color temperature, then it's the same quote I use, that is, a color is a color only based on what's surrounding that color. So if you put a color in a field of one color versus another color, that color you put in the middle of that field will appear different.
Well, what's the best way to learn that? How do you, because I find that color temperature is I see a lot of people nailing values, but I don't see a lot of people handling color temperature very well. Yeah.
Color temperature is it's a tricky thing because, obviously the impressionists chase this, where there's sometimes a vibration there, and that vibration, usually it happens when you have the same value but a different color. The eye can't interpret between the values, so it vibrates between color. So, back when I mentioned these 2 years I was kind of studying on my own, I actually went to the extent of taking a few primaries and a few other colors, mixing up kind of like color charts. I mixed up a whole value of family colors in a certain value, and then I'd take another single color, one of those primaries, and I'd plop it in the middle of the square of every of those. And I still bring them with me to teach the students. I bring these little studies I did. And I did them for me because it's amazing. You can have an orange, the same color orange against a violet, and put that same orange against, say, a blue or a green. That orange is going to look different based on whichever color, in that in that grid is behind it. So it's amazing what color can do. And that's the part you have to understand, is that you find the value, then you got to figure out, well, that only looks that green because it's surrounded by a red, or that green is so dead because it's surrounded by, another green that maybe deadens it down. So you start to learn to see color that way. Nature is so gray. I teach that as well, that, everyone wants paint right out of the tube. But you can't do that because nature is not. When you go out there, there's nothing in nature is really a pure color. And you find a few instances here and there. But we're working in a family of grays. I always tell my students, take a color chart when you see a sergeant comes on, through, or of a sergeant in a museum. Take your color charts in, hold it up against those paintings. You'll find that sergeant was nowhere near even a middle pure color. He was a master of grays. He understood temperature, and that's why he was so amazing. Is because he could play in these grays and these temperatures rather than bringing out the full color. And I think once you get a handle on that, your communication skills open up, because now you have even more keys, like on a piano, to play with.
It makes the paintings feel more elegant, more refined.
Absolutely. And you have to have gray to have color, and you have to have color to have grays. What happens is, I know everybody's walked into a gallery before, and there's certain galleries out there where the walls are just splashed with color. And it gets to a point where it's overwhelming. You don't have a sense of ease or peace because everything's screaming at you. It's like music, You have a soloist. If everybody's playing at the same the same octave, the same key, and trying to scream, it's not music, it's chaos. It's the same with painting. You've got to learn to use harmony and to settle those areas down so the parts you do want to sing can really sing.
Well, it's to that same point, composition plays a very similar role in the sense that, a straight line is peaceful, a vertical line creates tension, an angular line creates a different kind of tension, and so on.
Yeah.
So you were talking about color temperature, but I've seen many examples of a color inside of a color. I think Joseph Albers did the definitive book on that back in the 1940s or 50s. I met somebody recently that studied at in his class.
Cool.
But that's not necessarily just about color temperature. That's more about color interaction.
Yes.
So are you also doing things with color temperature?
Absolutely. So to expound on that, is I'm just kind of covering how to see color. That a color is not a color; it's only that color based on what's surrounding it. So once you figure that out, then temperature comes into play, and temperature is just warming or cooling the next passage. So I came with understanding painting planes. Planes are a big deal, right? For every plane, there's not only a different source of light, but a different source of reflected color, say. So think like on a head, for example, the cheekbone and the jawbone and those areas can be the same value, but if there's a plane change, then there's going to be a color change, because nowhere in our atmosphere, in this sphere we live in, each plane is going to take on another source of, whether it be reflected light or ambient light or actual light. So, when you look at these plane changes, a lot of times they're in the same value range. You're just going to get a color change. Well, in that color change, you can, but it usually doesn't show up in nature. Jump from, say, one primary to another primary. You're going to have a small jump. So it could be in them, and it could be in a violet family, and that next plane still in the violet family, but it leans to a little more red instead of blue. So you have to understand how when you see how planes work, you are going to have a temperature change, for every plane change. And ironically, when you change the value, adding white, that changes the color anyway. So when you change a value, you're actually changing the color as well, and that's another temperature thing you have to understand. So yeah, temperature plays a big part, and knowing how far to go within those temperature changes is the real trick. I mean, I still to this day feel I could be more subtle in some of my jumps, but I kind of, it's kind of my weakness. I love to chase nuance. So to the point where I know it affects the overall painting, because I'll be in there like, oh my gosh, look at that color, and I'll make this little tiny change. I stand back, and it has nothing to do with the whole picture, right? So I go down these roads where I'm chasing little color changes and little light effects that I just love, but in the overall scheme, my painting may be weaker because of it, because I'm not holding the big picture together. But it's kind of what gets, it's kind of the thing that gets the gusto in me, gets me inspired and motivated to see these little nuances, because they're there. But coming back full circle to be aesthetic, sometimes you have to forfeit those and paint for the bigger picture. But yeah, temperature, obviously it's warmer or cooler, and ironically there's a warm and cool in the warm side, and there's a warm and cool in the cool side. You just can't let them interfere with each other. If something's too warm on the cool side, it will jump over to, say, the warm side of the form. So there's a lot of play there that you've got to stay in control.
So I just want to probe this just a little bit further, because I'm curious.
Sure.
Do you try to follow a principle or a rule when you're doing this? For instance, do you always try to have a cool next to a warm? Is that kind of it?
No, because, well, when you say cool next to a warm, they can still both be warm. One's just cooler. So that's where the language, the verbal language, sometimes doesn't maybe communicate what we visually see. So let's say you have warm light and a cool shadow, or you have warm light as a source of light. You're going to have cool shadows. I can never leave that principle. The moment I do, I've left the natural world. If you truly want to be a natural, representational painter. So we live by these principles, right? I can't remember this quote by Sorolla. He basically said that the moment we leave nature and her principles, then we've left the world of believability or representation.
The world of physics, really.
Yeah, true. Absolutely right. And so this idea of warm and cool, let's say I have a warm light and cool shadow, then all my shadows need to stay cool in the cool family. But inside those shadows, I might have reflected oranges or reds, and they're warm, but they're only warmer compared to the cool that's in the shadow side of the form. If I start to paint those too warm, then they leave the shadow side or the cool side of the form and go into the warm side of the form. Then your form falls apart.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I'm staring at a painting on your website. It's called It's All Downhill From Here.
Yeah.
And there's a big shadow space that's got a lot of warmth in it, but when I squint down on it, it goes all cool.
Never leaves the cool family. It can't. The moment it does, it then no longer represents physics, as you mentioned. It's like gravity.
Now, what about Ken Oster's old theory about warm light and cool light, in reversing that, where sometimes he's finding warm shadows? Do you believe the same concepts?
No, I don't. But the ironic thing is with artistic principles, and Ken probably knew him well enough. I'm trying to think of. I know his work. I'm just trying to think of one that maybe he used that. But the point is if you know the principle well enough as an artist, you can break it. There's a great book I mentioned in my classes as well by Harley Brown. He has a head sketch in his first book. I think it's Everything They Taught Me About Painting or something like that. Anyway, he has a head in there where he uses all the wrong color for this head portrait. I mean, he's got green skin, violet skin, pink skin. It looks like a horrid color palette. But it works because his values are so keyed on that the value overrides the color. He's able to get away with this crazy color because the values read. And I know Ken would do that. His values were well enough done that he could push color, and it makes the painting exciting, obviously, because it's a little out of bounds with physics. but at least he had the control of knowing what he was doing when he did it. I think that's the problem. You got to know what you're doing. You got to know these principles in order to break them.
Makes sense.
Does that makes sense? Yeah. So
now there's also a color principle about trying to put a complementary side by side. It's the old put some purple next to the yellow. Do you do any of that?
I do sometimes. I can think of a painting I did of Venice, and that's what caught my eye, is that where the water hit the wall, you had this green. That when the light went into the water, it was green, and where the shadow met the wall, they kind of met there together, and you had this green wave going on against this red wall, and that I kind of used that in the painting. Specifically with that painting, I was able to use that as a principle. But I'm more apt that optically our brain seeks for a compliment. And so when I look at the first thing I do when I look at, and we all know greens are a very hard thing for most people to capture. And I grew up in the Northwest, which everything's green. So, I mean, the moss on your back, moss is on your back, and the trunks of the trees have moss on them. I mean, it's just green on green. And I ironically used to use Viridian when I moved there. And after a year of painting outdoors, I realized it was finding its way into everything. So I took green off my palette and forced myself to mix green so that I could kind of harmonize these greens. Well, also when you look at a green is the one color that it can be least in its own family and still read green. I'll repeat that. It can be the least amount of green in its own family, right? It can have a lot of red in it, brown in it, a warm color, and it will still read green even though it's not in a pure green family. So when I look out at a tree or a saguaro or something, the first thing I ask is how much red. I look for the red in it. And that's because your eye is always seeking complement. And I find that when I do that, I'll find red somewhere in that green. And that helps me harmonize and know that green isn't right out of the tube. So that in nature, I seek it that way. Let's put it that way. I don't necessarily maybe put it on my palette, but I'm always seeking the complement. Another interesting kind of aha experience I had in the Northwest was I had this view outside my front patio of Mount Hood, and it had snow on it. And I was out looking at it one day, watching the sunset on it, and the snow was so pink, right? You get this late light, it was really pink, and I kept looking at the shadows going, man, those shadows are green. That can't be green. And I watched it, and I couldn't see any blue in it. It felt blue, but if I really looked, it was green. Yeah. So I actually went into my studio and did it. And when the sun went down, I went into the studio and just did a little comp, and came to find out that those shadows were pure Viridian. So what happens is you're seeing all that pink light on that white snow. Your eye is seeking the complement to counterbalance all that pink. And therefore, those shadows were a pure Viridian. I've done several paintings that way where when it's that late a light, those shadows are actually Viridian. They'll pure blue.
Yeah, if you go back to the old Sidney Lawrence. Lawrence
Sidney
lived
Lawrence
up in the Northwest and painted a lot in Alaska.
Yeah.
You find a lot of pink mountains with green shadows.
Yeah, and that's how it really is. In that environment at that time, that's truly how the physics of the sun is working. And so, it's those little things that you're like, wow, kind of have an eye opener. Like, the world isn't always what it seems or what you think it is. You have to learn to really see optically. And I base my classes a lot on the optics of the eye, and trying to divorce our brains and the symbolism that our brains have with color. If I say the sky is, you'll say blue. Grass is, you'll say green. Well, those symbols are so powerful and so bred in us that almost everybody has a hard time divorcing our brains from the symbolism. And so to learn to see optically, you have to truly divorce yourself from what your brain thinks and actually relearn to see optically.
It's really true. I mean, it's something that I think everybody fights. It's this, like, you're looking up at the sky and you just feel like, no, there's no blue there, but I feel like I should put a little in there. Yeah. Because nobody will know it's a sky. It's exactly. And we have the same problem with symbolism with trees and bushes. We want to make them, sticks green with balls on them.
Yeah, and the color again always comes back to the color. They got to be green. And you have to really learn to really see. I mean, there's times I've painted in the late evening light, and I look up, and if I really look at the color, that sky is just, I mean, it looks like mud. It's ugly, ugly color. And you're so afraid to put it in there because it's going to look muddy. But once you put it in, and if it's accurate to the landscape, boy, it becomes opalescent and brilliant, even though it doesn't seem like that color could be up there in that sky, you know.
Do you try to show the shift of temperature in the sky?
Absolutely. I'm always looking for, in fact, I don't do it enough, play color. But I'm always looking, you know, when you really go out and study, you'll realize that you have light, both value and color changes vertically from the horizon to the zenith, but it also changes left to right. Mm-hmm. You know, I'll see these big panoramic paintings that are, you know, maybe a 24 by 60, and they'll have the same color sky from left to right. But when you really go out and study, the side that the source of light is from is going to be keyed up and have, you know, a little more warmth in it than the side that's farthest from the sun. So you got to be aware that colors transfer both vertically and horizontally, you know, in your line of vision. So, yeah, I'm always trying to be aware of that.
So, do you have some kind of a system that you put yourself through before you put the brush down and say, okay, this is done? Do you have like a checklist in your head? You're going to go and say, okay, did I capture the, you know, the warmer side of the sky? Did I get, you know, go through?
No, I probably should though, huh? No, you know, I guess it's funny, you know, I was talking to somebody recently about teaching art and painting for yourself are two different balls of wax. I mean, it's great as a teacher because you learn. You have to learn to verbalize and use these principles and share them. But when you're painting, it's so intuitive. And so, you know, a lot of it comes from feeling. I'll work on a painting and I'm battling it, and it just sometimes it comes to, yeah, I could probably lick this thing some more, but I'm just going to let it go out the door. But then a few months later, it comes back and doesn't sell, and you're like, well, now I know why. I should have rethought that and spent a little more time with it. But, you know, I don't really have a checklist. I just kind of, I know what I'm going after, maybe, I guess you could say, and I do my best to try to accomplish that. And I just have a point where I feel like, okay, there's not much more I can say about what I was trying to maybe accomplish. You know, I'm not that, I know a few artists, a good friend of mine she takes notes with her paintings. When they're done, she'll sit down and she'll actually go through and note where she was weak and where she was strong. And I'm just not that personality type, maybe. I just kind of wing it from the hip, and when it feels right, it feels right. So
well, and I think that's it. You know, we all have these different personality types, and you know, some people are very technical or very anal or very list oriented. Some of us are very, you know, much different than that. So I think you have to paint to yourself. And do you? I think this is a stupid question, so I'll ask it anyway because
there's no such thing as a stupid question. I tell my students that.
This might be the first one.
Okay.
You know, when it comes to I think this is really a question more for the beginner, and that is when it comes to making a choice between a good painting or accuracy, you're obviously going for a good painting, correct?
With me, I'm so heavy on. I was coming from my background. Draftsmanship was just beaten into my head, so it's sometimes hard to let go to almost separate those two. But I will admit there comes a point where, yes, design. If a little bit of quirkiness lends itself to design in the right condition, then yes, accuracy can be let go. Usually it comes down to playing the color, color or vibrancy or whatever. You can be, you can get away with not being true to nature and get away with it. When it comes to drawing, it's pretty important. Even when you're abstracting, there comes a point where even the shape, if you're abstracting the image, the shapes become drawing issues in themselves. And so it's kind of hard, like you said, it's kind of hard for me to separate those two because it's always on the back of my mind. I'm aware of say my drawing. And so a finished painting's got to have some of that in it, obviously, right?
Yeah. Well, there's just so many different types. I know people. I've had people. I've interviewed people who will tell me, you know, when they're outdoors, they want to be as accurate as possible. They won't move a tree. That, you know, they might keep a telephone pole out or something, but they want to be as accurate as possible. And then,
right.
you know, they'll bring it into the studio, and then when they're doing a studio version, you know, that's when they'll move the tree or otherwise. I just was curious about that.
Maybe we were on two different wavelengths of thought. I was thinking more studio work. I won't let it out the door. When I'm outside painting on site, boy, there's a lot of times I will absolutely let the drawing go. If I'm in a rush, I got 15 minutes to pull off a sunset, man, drawing goes out the door as I teach my students. I am there to get the information of value and color, because the camera will never capture those two things. So I come home with my photograph, and I got this sloppy sketch that's got the proper value and color. I'm good all day long because the photograph gives me the drawing and proportions. It's the value and color the camera can't give me. That's why I'm out there. In fact, early on I approached painting as I wanted to get a finished painting, PleinAir. Now it's 10 times out of 10 I could care less about getting a finished painting. It is all information gathering for me. And that's where I feel like maybe PleinAir, the term, has gotten to be where it's an end in itself, right? I'm doing a PleinAir painting to get a PleinAir painting to sell. And I don't look at it that way at all. I mean, it's just like painting the figure from life. I mean, you're in the studio painting the figure in a maybe a life session situation where I'm not there to get a finished painting of the figure. I'm there to study the figure, and I'm outside to study outside. I tell people it's like you're an author. You're writing a book. You've got to go out. You got to find out your outline. You got to place the story. You got to figure out where the climax is. Who's the important characters in the story. Then you get back with that draft and you write your novel. It's the same with PleinAir. I'm out there to get notes and information. It takes all the pressure off of me to try to produce. And it's actually sometimes now it's become a time of play where I can explore and experiment because it allows me to try new things or try to chase something that maybe I felt was unattainable before, or focus on a certain aspect of painting, whether it be edges, line, shape. And so those, to me, that's what I'm out there. I'm out there taking notes, and then I come back into the studio. Now we're talking a finished painting. What I was referring to, I won't let it go out the door without the drawing being absolutely appropriate. But in a PleinAir setting, oh yeah, I will let all kinds of things go. I'll move mountains and move trees and whatever it takes to play with composition and design, and get that information I need, to play out a concept or an idea.
And when you're outdoors, are you like painting small and trying to get a lot of different studies done in a particular location? Are you painting large?
Yeah, it's funny. I've gotten smaller over the years. I used to work 12-16 down to 9x12. That was kind of where my groove was. Now I do some of these PleinAir events, and some of these guys are trying to crank out, and they do them okay, 24, 30s, and that kind of thing. And to me, I'm more after the moment, so I'll go as big as say 16, 20 usually. But anymore, I mean, just this last week, I went out painting, and I think I was doing 6x8s, 5x7s. I did a trip to Santa Barbara about a month ago, and I was doing 4x8s because they allow me time. Those small formats allow me time to think, because I have to edit and simplify it to its core. So it allows me to edit, and it gives me a little more time to say, what if I do this, or what if I do that, without having to.
Well, you don't feel that sense of commitment either. I mean, you could sit there and do 4 of them in a row.
Exactly.
And,
exactly.
I find that when I travel, it's always the issue about, do I want to get a good painting or do I want to get a good study? And when you're traveling, you're snapping photographs. I hate to paint from photographs because I can't get any information out of them other than maybe the drawing part. But painting 4 or 5 little paintings in a day. That way I can get a lot of different scenes to work from rather than standing in one place and doing it for 3 or 4 hours.
Yeah, and that's exactly how I feel about it. And again, it really comes down to me. By working smaller, I'm able to, how do I say this? How to declutter. It forces me to really simplify and get the nuts and bolts of what it is I want to say, right? And use that as an idea. It's an idea finder. Will this work? And I work on them, and I think about them, and I'm able to really chase those little nuances that I'm a sucker of. And sometimes the paintings are so small I can't really go in and I'll see a little great transition, and I'm like, well, that's like a little tiny 3-hair brush. I can't put that in there, but it gives me time to slow down. That's what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to get my students to maybe work a little smaller and not rush, really work on it so they really have a concept of what they're looking at, and therefore it's easier to put down because they can take the time to study it. Versus, I work large, I'm in a rush, I'm hurrying, I'm trying to get this thing covered. Whereas I work smaller, I still work through them pretty quick because it's just my nature, but at least it gives me a moment to say, that's not going to work, or this might work, or it just frees me up a little bit to really study and not get a quote unquote finished painting. It takes that thought of I got to have this 9x12 ready to frame.
I'm going to throw out a couple of terms, and what I'd like you to do is comment on thoughts on how to paint those things.
Okay.
You mentioned sunsets.
Sunsets are tricky. If you're looking into the light, boy, I'm not very good at them. I got a good friend of mine who's a dynamite painter when it comes to these. But the problem is you see so much color, but color leaves the middle value family. So when you start getting to a high key, which truly what is out there when you're looking at that into the sun, it's a high key painting, but there's no color because your colors become tints when you add white to them. So the trick with looking into the light is your values are much darker than you think they are in order to maintain the saturation of color. Now, if you're looking away from the light, which is I'm more comfortable doing, when you get these amazing pinks and reds, let's say a mountain behind you, or that you're looking into this mountain where the sun's hitting on it, then it becomes a real play of color. I don't have to push my value down so far, and I can really explore that. So when you say sunset, it kind of depends on the situation, right? On whether you're looking into the light or down the light. Now,
looking into the light is so hard to do.
It really is, and again, what happens is you want to key it up. I can't tell you how many times that paintings I think I nail it, and I come home and the painting's like so keyed up it doesn't look like a sunset. So, those and there are certain elements you have to say, what, I can't capture that in paint. That's been a real hard one for me, and it's probably only been the last 5 years I realized that. I mean, as a younger painter, I'm like, I'm going to get that. I have the challenge. I love a challenge. But
well, you look at the limitations of the values of certain colors like reds.
Yeah.
I mean, you look at a sky that's filled with these brilliant reds or these brilliant pinks, and yet you try to bring them up in value. All of a sudden, you wash them out, and they look like creamsicle.
Yeah, and that's why I say the tint. You have to understand your pigments. You've now tinted the color. It becomes a tint and not a true full chroma color. So that's why I say you got to drop your values when you paint those sunsets because otherwise your color's gone. So I've come to terms that, man, there's sometimes I'll be out photographing, like, man, I'd love to paint that. But then in my mind, I'm like, you know what? It's unattainable. I mean, there's some artists who have done it in the past and they're brilliant. But boy, you really got to know what you're doing if you're gonna play that looking into the light and the sunset. Sorry, I was gonna say, but the thing with the sunset is you have to understand the nature of the light. I mean, you understand the temperature of the light affects everything it falls upon. So if you understand that and you know that what's falling in front of you has got a lot of pink in it, then that pink's going to show up everywhere in your light and your shadows. So basically, your whole color harmony moves to a pink family or an orange family because you have to move the whole scale of temperature in that direction because that's really what's happening.
So will you when you're looking at a scene, will you say to yourself before you start it, okay, this is going to be dominated by this particular tone or this particular color?
Absolutely. I'll look at what is the color of the light. I just did a few paintings back in at the Cape Ann event there back in Gloucester, and I did a nocturne, and I set up to paint, and I kept thinking, man, what is that color? Because it was pitch black. We had some nice, it was gas lights is what it was. These gas lights along the waterfront there, and these boats up on dry dock, and they had this light. I kept trying to figure out what color is that. And you look at the light, the gas light, and you couldn't really tell. You could see the temperature of it. It was kind of a greeny temperature. And once I figured that out, I looked at the boats. I'm like, oh my gosh! I realized all the lights have this green color, and you're thinking, how am I going to paint green? It doesn't look like light. But by holding to that principle and truly optically painting what I see, knowing that that light has a green tone, it made it so much easier to see the subject once I understood it was a green gas light. And hopefully I pulled the painting off. I had one artist who actually, who we both know, whose comment is, boy, you really got that nice gas light. He knew what kind of light it was. He knew that it was a green colored light, Where most lay people would look at it and not know that. But when you do know it, it sure does help you understand, how your harmony is working.
Well, that's another one of those great examples, much like the green shadows, against a pink mountain, where you've got to overcome what's in your brain, which is telling you green is not the color of light.
Yep.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to rely on your optics. Exactly.
There's a wonderful Frank Tenney Johnson nocturne painting that I copied because I wanted to really learn how he did it, because he was so good at nocturne paintings.
Yeah.
And there was so much green light in it.
Yeah.
And it doesn't read that way when you look at it, but when you start studying it, there's lots of greens.
I probably know which one it is. He did several. Scott always has that white horse with a green cast to it.
Yeah.
He knew it. He knew his stuff. That was one artist that never got the as much praise as I think he should have. He was above. He was levels above everybody else around him.
So who are some of the other artists that from the past that have really inspired you, that go beyond the big four or the big six that we always hear about?
Yeah, it's funny. Zorn, Zorn's probably my guy. I started out loving Sargent and seeking out Sargents and kind of looking at his stuff closely. And when I hit Zorn, boy, there is so much truth to what he saw. And I teach him. It took me years of studying his work that it dawned on me what you're seeing when you look at Zorn. I tell my students this because obviously the squint is so important, right? We squint to simplify. What we see when we look at a Zorn is what he was seeing with his eyes half closed. I mean, we are seeing what he saw squinted. There's no doubt about it. He was simplifying those forms to like nobody else. In fact, I've got a quote where Sorolla said of Zorn, "This is how we should all paint." I mean, he was praising Zorn, that he's the real guy. There's several others out there. Edward Seago, I'm sure a lot of landscape painters know him. He kind of had his own thing, his own approach, but boy, he could really give you a sense of space and atmosphere.
We don't hear much about Seago in the United States. He's big in Britain.
Yeah, big English painter. Yeah, there's a whole group of painters over there. The Glasgow boys are a big influence on me. Brangwyn was probably a real heavy hitter in college. I obviously knew about Dean Cornwell, and in studying Dean Cornwell, found out he had gone over to use Brangwyn's mural studio, and so I started to research Brangwyn. In the last 20 years ago, I went over to specifically see an exhibition by him, and then another time went over and went to Bruges to go to his museum, which ironically I showed up and they had it closed. All the works were sent out, and they literally had one etching behind the desk they let me look at. So I was pretty bummed about that. So I had to make another pilgrimage over to see that a second time. I went to William Morris, has quite a big collection of his too. And then about 12 years ago, went back and saw another major exhibition on Brangwyn. He was a big one for me because he was ahead of his time, really pushing design, abstraction. And another artist he doesn't, those who really study painting know him, but he's just not someone in the in the forefront of the public eye. And I just think he was a master of all things when it comes to design.
Well, that's what's exciting for me. When I do these trips to Europe every year with a group of people, and we go to all the museums and we meet with the curators, and inevitably every year there's an artist that I hear about that I've never heard of before. That and maybe not necessarily even somebody who's well known, but somebody who's just an absolute rock star.
Yeah. And after college, when I had this job as an illustrator, we worked into doing animation stuff for educational software. And so lunch break came, I'd sit at my desk instead of in the lunchroom and I'd surf. I went down I'd love to go down rabbit holes and research who, painters and who they studied and who they were. And I've come across guys that in, the last 30 years that, whether they died at polio at 30 or, had a sickness at 34, they would have become as good, if not better than the guys, the four we're talking about now. Their lives were just taken from them. So, I love going down these rabbit holes and finding these artists that were just, so talented and so gifted. They just never, I guess it's like musicians, right? They never get out into the public eye or they don't become a pop star. And so they're never known.
Well, I have a theory on that, and I won't go too deep into it, but I think that I've started realizing as I've studied painting my whole life now, or maybe not the whole life, but the last 20 years, is that most of the painters who got recognition were really good self-promoters.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are exceptions to that, but it's, there are constantly people being discovered who were really rock star painters who painted for 60 or 70 years, and yet nobody ever saw their work. Yeah. Because they were, they were shy or they, didn't feel comfortable putting themselves out there. But, there's tons of painters out there that nobody ever heard of that are equally as good as some of the ones we have heard of. Yeah, one thing I also find, Mitch, is that we're in a time right now where there's probably more good painters than any other time in history. I mean, the quality of painting that's coming out of especially in the plein air world and this movement, there are just dozens and dozens and dozens of really, really fine painters. Yeah.
I find these kids, if you start looking at the academy in Russia, man, some of these kids coming out are like, they're unbelievable. It's scary. You're thinking, well, there goes my career. Yeah. These guys are going to come in and take over, Well, same with the Chinese painters too. They're just so gifted.
The Chinese painters are all going to the Russian academies, and the standards are so stringent that you have to be a fairly accomplished painter and draftsperson going in to get into those schools. I mean, if you get into the Sarakov or the Repin, they have 2,500 applicants and they pick 30.
Yeah, absolutely. And boy, once you're in there, I think it used to be this way at the Art Center. That's where my teacher graduated from. And Art Center, same thing. It was, man, you were up day and night working. It was no easy slouch, just get a degree. You really had to produce and hustle and really educate yourself. I think that the art schools now, we're going to go into that, but I have such a problem with the art schools and what's happened to them that it's just a shame. That's why my mentor, when he came back to teach, he said, I'm not here to make money or here for the school. I'm here to pass on information that is absolutely being lost and not shared. Boy, so I'm forever grateful to him and give him most of my kudos, because it was without him, I wouldn't be who I am or where I am today. So.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating interview. You are, I could talk to you for hours more, and I think people could listen more. Yeah. Before we wrap up, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share with everybody?
No, other than find truth. Truth in painting isn't just, obviously we're going to go outside and we're going to plein air, paint plein air and paint truth. But to that truth, there's aesthetics, there's concepts of the design. I kind of say it's like gravity, right? You can't defy gravity. Well, there's principles of light. And principles of even application and the way a painting looks that need to be there in order for it to be convincing and believable. Now we're talking representational painting, And those things all file under this idea of design. And I just don't think design is taught as much. And that's what's become so passionate about me. And I think there is a difference between art and fine art. Fine art is using these principles to better our communication in a visual way. I mean, we are communicators, and we have to find out, how do we visually communicate the best way, just as an author needs to have a pretty eloquent vocabulary to tell a story. So we need to have these same skills. Well, I don't think enough people dive in to find these skills and to apply those skills to the image. And that's what drives me. Yeah, I see a pretty landscape, but then I look at it and say, well, how can I make it better? How can I use line, or how can I use pattern, or how can I use maybe a color vibration to make this thing be even greater than just an art piece of a painting? I want it to be a fine art statement, a statement where it's based on a kind of like a cornerstone that makes it go above and beyond just a simple image.
And I would say that that's so hard to articulate.
It really is.
And you've done it beautifully. But, I think that the difference between a painting and a fine art painting is about 2%.
I find it a little more.
Do you?
Maybe because when I stand in front of it, I'm not just in awe of maybe the application of the paint. When you look at a Fession, right? Obviously, you're like, wow, the guy just was all guts.
He rocked it.
All expression. But then you stand back and you start to break down his paintings. It wasn't about all that expression and surface play. He's got design elements underlying that painting. It's like Rockwell. People love Rockwell. They understand Rockwell because of these great characters. He was a genius at characterizing a scene and giving it a feeling. But when you strip all that away and you look at the painting as an actual artistic composition, you lay a grid over that, and you'll find that every part of that painting is put on a grid and is put on using all these tools of composition that you wouldn't see unless it was drawn out to you. I had my teacher would come in, he'd lay one out, and he'd do a trace. He used tracing paper, and he'd draw over these and blow in all these, circle outside the field of the square that you're looking at, and that circle would run through the painting. He'd place things on the edge of this circle, or they'd lay it on a grid where everything's meeting at the edges of the painting. I mean, you start to realize these guys were not just sitting down and painting; they were composing like nobody's business. And that, to me, is what makes those paintings. Well, it's not, people love them for the obvious reason because they're cute, but also our brain seeks organization. And when you start looking at the way they organize these paintings, then you're like, okay, that's the thing I'm talking about. There's another fine art there where you're communicating on almost another level than just reproducing a pretty image.
So do you have some kind of a tool that you use for yourself when you're creating your composition? Some kind of a grid? You talked about circles. Is there some particular approach?
In college, as an illustrator, we had a few assignments and I would do that. Now it's more intuitive. I'm looking for what they call paneling, where a line runs through the painting. And so I'll use that intuitively as I go, but I don't necessarily grid up like those guys were doing. I mean, their paintings were so involved as an illustration, right? You've got several things going on, and where I'm painting a landscape or some chickens, I don't have that much to really dive into that. If I was doing an illustration, then that I'd be much more aware of it. But I am aware of it, and I'm looking for guys out there, guys I admire. They know it. They may not tell you, but they know it. And whether it's being intuitively or not, it's in their paintings. And when you come to kind of learn that, the sad thing is there's nobody out there really teaching it. There's not a lot of books. I mean, Andrew Loomis has a great book. His Creative Illustration talks a little bit about that, and he used it quite a bit. But these are design tools that were kind of lost when the modern art movement came along, and I won't go into that. I could spend days on that. But the idea that these were principles that were known to even some of the general public in the late 19th century, and it was all kind of lost. With this resurgence of representational painting, it's coming back. Some of that stuff's being re-explored and kind of refound, I guess, or rediscovered. And I just think those are things that are important that we need to think about not just replicating a pretty picture, but to really make it stand on a cornerstone of design.
Well, what a great way to end. Mitch,
Well,
thank you. Thank you so much for doing this today. This has been a really delightful interview and fascinating. I think we could keep going and dig in for a lot longer, and I wish we had the time.
My problem is I can never shut up. My students know that I love to talk. So, but no, it was a real pleasure. I've been, like I said, I'm sorry it's 10 months to be able to nail this down, but I just was traveling. But I was looking forward to it the moment we got it scheduled.
What a great guy! What a great artist! Very articulate. Mitch Baird, thank you very much. Are you ready for some marketing ideas?
This is the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads, author of the #1 Amazon bestseller, Make More Money Selling Your Art, Proven Techniques to Turn Your Passion into Profit.
Well, in the Marketing Minute, I try to answer your art marketing questions. Email them to me, eric@artmarketing.com. That's a new email address, not eric@pleinairmagazine.com. That way they go straight to the art marketing questions. Before I get to questions, a quick thought. The majority of us go into the year without a plan. And if we make plans, we tend to make them after the year starts. It's like New Year's comes, it's like, oops, I better do something. My 2020 plans have been done for months. I work on them in July, and you still have some time. And I think you really want to take time with your plans. Don't just whip them together in 10 seconds. Take a day, take a couple of days, really be thoughtful. I take 5 days to work on my plans. Yep, 5 days, and I bring all my folks in and we talk about things together. So now's the time to lay out your plan for the year. What are your goals? Pick no more than 3 goals for the year. 3 big goals. Big goals, right? And then prioritize them. Which one is most important? Which is second most important? And so on. Then you build a plan to accomplish each goal. We use what are called KPIs, key performance indicators. These are the steps towards a goal, the things you need to accomplish a goal. So every goal has multiple steps. Sometimes those steps might be 50 things that you have to do throughout the course of a year. And then sometimes those steps have steps that you have to get to. So what would be an example? A step for, let's say your goal is to sell $50,000 worth of paintings. That means KPI would be you have to say, okay, well, I have to sell so many paintings a month. That means I have to sell so many paintings a week. That means I have to sell so many paintings a day. If you're focused on those numbers all the time and you just pay attention to them, it's like, well, I haven't sold a painting today. I better get on the phone and see what I can do. I know that sounds oversimplified, but the idea is that you take everything and break it out into many steps. So your goals have many steps. If you accomplish 3 big goals for the year, you're doing a pretty good job. And I don't always accomplish 3 goals, but I always try to accomplish the #1 goal. And everything I do in my business and in my life related to that goal is to drive that goal home. And so other things, the reason that's important, because you get all these distractions and you can say to yourself, well, am I paying attention to my goal, or am I doing something that has nothing to do with my goal? Sometimes you have things you have to do, like, you have to feed the kids. So anyway, that's one way to think about this. Now, here's a question from Nick in Tybee Island, Georgia, who says, with the holidays coming up, I'm considering a seasonal sale. Are there any guidelines for selling art at a discount for the holidays? Thank you, Nick. First, why are you instantly assuming you need to offer a discount? This is not a good practice. Discounts are usually held for times when things are tough and not selling. The holidays are when people are spending money. Yes, they do like discounts. There's no question about it. But they're not necessarily looking for discounts all the time, especially something like a luxury item like a painting. Discounts are something we do in our heads. They're not necessarily required. In retail, of course, they create the perception of discounts. If you walk into, let's say, the Limited, they always have, normal price $100, today's price $50, 50% off, but that's actually their normal price. So I suppose you can do that. But, rather than doing a sale, just do a show. I go to open studios here in Austin all the time, and I don't see anybody discounting work. I mean, there's a demand for work and that type of thing. So don't worry about the price right now. worry about getting people in the door. The more people in the door, the more demand you create on your product, and price is less of an issue. The key point is to get them into the studio early. Get the word out. Do a mailing, do an emailing, tell all your friends, tell them several times, don't just tell them once. Hold a reception at your studio or at your house, invite everybody, and then have somebody there to act as your salesperson so that you can simply twinkle to the crowd, tell them the stories of the paintings, just meld with them and just spend time with them. Stories sell paintings. I teach that in my art marketing boot camp, I think the number 1 video. Anyway, it's kind of late to be planning it, but you can still pull it off for this year. We're all desperate for last minute ideas, especially affluent people who need last minute ideas. So get moving on this fast. Next question is from Dean in Fort Worth, Texas, who says, I know that Instagram and Facebook are popular social media sites for artists, but do you think it's good to have a presence on LinkedIn as well, or is that just for corporate networking? Well, think of it this way, Dean. First off, you have to be everywhere. If you're on social media, you've got to be on social media where your customers are. Where are your customers? Well, you might be surprised. They might be on LinkedIn. There are big networking groups on LinkedIn for art collectors. There are gallery networks on LinkedIn. There's a lot of things that you can do to penetrate that world and be seen in there. So LinkedIn, I think, is a valuable resource. But my rule is if I can't do a good job, I don't do it at all. I do a good job on Facebook. I do a good job on Instagram. I don't do a very good job on Twitter, and I don't do a very good job on LinkedIn. I posted something there the other time, I think for the first time ever. And it's because I only have so much time and only so many resources. So pick the one that's going to be best for you. Now, there's this common misperception, and everybody just continually tells themselves this is the way to do things. And that misperception is that everybody who's on your friend list is going to see every post. The reality is only about 2% that are going to see it. So don't expect them to see it. Also, keep in mind, your friends are usually your friends, your acquaintances. And so they're people who are not necessarily your customers. So focus on customers. Anyway, I hope that helps. That was the Marketing Minute.
This has been the Marketing Minute with Eric Rhoads. You can learn more at artmarketing.com.
Also, if you've not seen my blog where I talk about life, art, and other things, check it out. It's called Sunday Coffee, and you can find it at coffeewitheric.com. This is always fun. We'll do it again sometime like next week. I'll see you then. I'm Eric Rhoads, publisher and founder of PleinAir Magazine. Remember, it's a big world out there. Go paint it. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
This has been the PleinAir Podcast with PleinAir Magazine's Eric Rhoads. You can help spread the word about plein air painting by sharing this podcast with your friends. And you can leave a review or subscribe on iTunes so it comes to you every week. And you can even reach Eric by email, eric@pleinairmagazine.com. Be sure to pick up our free ebook, 240 plein air painting tips by some of America's top painters. It's free at pleinairtips.com. Tune in next week for more great interviews. Thanks for listening.